So, what are the constitutional protections for crime, or to protect somebody, I guess, from the government, perhaps coming after us inappropriately or whatever? Anyhow, the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution provides civil liberties, right, that protect people, okay, and businesses from the power of the government. Okay. It also protects businesses supposedly from excessive regulation. You'd probably get a lot of businesses that might argue with you about that if it does protect it, it's not doing its job. But anyhow, the Fourth Amendment, right? Unreasonable searches and seizures, and that extends to businesses as well. There can't be unreasonable searches and seizures, although we'll talk about, here in a bit, there are some exceptions perhaps. Extends to certain civil matters, so not just criminal matters, but also civil matters. Now, how about an expectation of privacy? And when we talk about the Fourth Amendment, I don't recall if I've told the story, but this happened in Montana here quite a while back. But there was a party going on. It was a high school party, and the parents were gone, and the kids were boozing, and the cops were called, and the cops showed up, and they entered the house with they had reasonable suspicion. And so they entered the house, started giving out tickets, MIPs, and they got to a door that was locked, and it was a bathroom, and they knocked on the door, and they said, please come out, and the young lady that was in there refused. She said, no, I'm not coming out. And she stayed locked in the bathroom, and they, I believe, entered then. They, after given amount of time, I think, told her they were coming in, made sure she was decent, and then they entered and gave her an MIP, and the parents fought that MIP and said, wait a minute, she had a reasonable expectation of privacy. It wasn't her home, but she still had a reasonable expectation of privacy. She was in a bathroom, and the courts agreed with her, and so subsequently her charge was taken away. Okay, she was exonerated. Well, I wouldn't say exonerated, but she wasn't charged then after all. Okay, in another case, it was at a like a convenience store, gas station type of thing, and a patron entered one of the bathrooms and heard some commotion going on in one of the stalls. Went and told the owner, the manager, and they called the cops, and the cops showed up, and turns out that there was a couple in the stall, and they were engaged in amorous activities, and so the cops entered and kind of put a stop to that, I'm sure, but then also they did some searching and found some drugs and charged the couple with drugs, and the couple fought and said that they had a reasonable expectation of privacy. And in this case, the court said, no, you were in a public restroom. You had no expectation of privacy in there. So, gray areas, gray, and a case-by-case situation, is how those things are going to get decided. And I wish I could tell you that there's a definitive line, but there's not. These are gray areas. Okay. We generally assume that there's an expectation of privacy. In other words, the police or enforcement agencies would have to have a good reason, right? Not for some businesses. And what do we mean by that? Well, in banking, for example, we were protected by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. As a result, we were subject to audits by the feds, okay? And every few months, they would show up at the door. They did not have to give us notice ahead of time. They often did, okay, but they did not have to. They could show up at the door and enter our bank and start going through our records. That was a part of the deal, okay? And that's the same with many other businesses that have certain regulators, be they federal or state, okay? They're open to inspection or search and possibly seizure at any given time. Isn't that interesting? Privacy's not in our Constitution, okay, but rose from common law decisions. So the Fifth Amendment says, in addition to all the kilo versus eminent domain types of things, the Fifth Amendment also says that we don't have to testify against ourselves. We cannot be compelled to testify against ourselves. So, in fact, if the defense counsel does not call a person the accused to the stand, the prosecutor cannot. Okay, but in any event, so it protects the accused from testifying against themselves, but it doesn't protect them from being required to provide evidence. So if they've got, bookkeeping records, those types of things, no, they can be compelled to show those. Okay, business records, phone records. In fact, your employer is required to keep certain records, like email. Okay, just so you know, if you work for a place and you have email access, which most places do nowadays, that they're required to keep certain records. Text messages are probably the same, if you're using a company phone, for doing texting and that kind of stuff. So, keep those things in mind, that not only can they obtain those records, but your place of business is required to keep certain records. So, the Fifth Amendment would protect sole proprietorship entity. That would be really anything other than a corporation. Could be a type of sole proprietorship entity. Okay, if it's singly owned, they kind of refer to that. A lot of entities might be an LLC, but it's basically a sole proprietorship. Okay, and again, double jeopardy, it prevents us from being tried to conclusion more than once for the same crime. So the Sixth Amendment, those typical things that we've talked about, I think, before when we talked about the Constitution, but speedy public trial, okay, with some exceptions. In the business sense, I don't think there'd be a lot of exceptions there. Most of the exceptions involve, sex or child-related crimes. And I suppose those could happen in a business sense, but typically in a business sense, we're dealing with business fraud, those types of things, and so they are going to be public. Still can have a trial by jury, and all the other things, right, that we talk about, that we've talked about before. So what are some specific business crimes? And we'll go through kind of each of these individually, but there's a pretty good list of them. So generally when corporations are charged with crime, corporate officers can also be criminally charged. True or false? Say absolutely true. Okay. If the corporation's charged with a crime, and go back, I was talking about Wells or the big banks, and most of those ended up being civil procedures. And likely because the government felt it might be difficult to prove the intent. Okay, and so a lot of those end up being civil procedures, and so the officers then maybe don't get dragged into it. They might lose their jobs. With Wells Fargo, John Stump was the CEO, and he's gone now. Okay, so they might lose their job. That could be something that the company decides. Okay, but they're generally not. They don't suffer any other penalties, from the government itself. Employees of some businesses do not have Fourth Amendment protections because of public policy considerations, and that's just my example of banking or, other industries, that may be regulated, the energy industry, right? The railroads, have certain regulations there that they have to follow, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, let's pause there and we'll come back and finish up here.